George Maharis, the tough guy from Route 66, was well known. Then he was gone. The 2 bathroom arrests that revealed his private life were held accountable by some. Others cited the unexplained disease that nearly claimed his life. Right now, after half a century, we finally understand what actually transpired and why the biggest star in Hollywood had to vanish before his most sinister secrets were revealed. On September 1, 1928, George Maharis was born in Astoria, Queens. Vasidos and Dimitra Maharis, his parents, were Greek immigrants who came to America in search of a better life. He was one of 7 kids growing up in a busy household. Crowded and noisy. The family relocated to Hell's Kitchen, a challenging Manhattan neighborhood where life was anything but simple, shortly after his birth. Money was always tight, and the streets were rough. In order to provide for the family, his father worked long hours at his restaurant. Maharis later recalled that they couldn't even afford a camera to take pictures of their early years, so there wasn't much space for luxury. His parents hoped he would find security and possibly even take over the family company. However, he did not envision that future for himself. He stated in a 2007 interview that, for him at least, growing up in Hell's Kitchen was all about saying, "I'm not going to stay here. The journey and the going are what make life what it is. I needed to leave." Before graduating, he left Flushing High School to enlist in the U.S. Marine Corps. He served his country for 18 months, developing resilience and discipline that would last a lifetime. He completed his high school education after coming home and began looking for his true calling. He initially assumed it would be music. He had the talent to support his dream of singing. Without the right training, he pushed his voice too hard, but he performed in high school and dreamed of a career on stage. His vocal cords were irreparably damaged as a result of the excessive strain. He could no longer pursue the career he had dreamed of. Even though the loss was devastating, he didn't give up easily. He would perform in other ways if music was not an option. He took action as a result of that choice. He threw himself into training, attending the Actors Studio in New York and the local playhouse. There, he received instruction from Sanford Meisner and Lee Strasberg, 2 of the industry's most renowned educators. They took an intense approach to acting, emphasizing full commitment to a role and emotional depth. George Maharis immediately became well known on the off-Broadway stage, where he began his acting career. He played the lead in Jean Genet's 1958 play Death Watch, which dealt with inmate power struggles. The New York Times praised him for his intense and unpredictable performance, saying he was able to handle characters with depth and complexity. He played another difficult part in Edward Albee's The Zoo Story, the first American staging of the now famous play, 2 years later. The narrative centered on a heated confrontation between 2 strangers in Central Park, one of whom was portrayed by Maharis as an emotionally unstable intruder. The New York Times' Brooks Atkinson described it as a superb acting performance and demonstrated Maharis' capacity to convey his character's unadulterated desperation. His status as a rising star was cemented in 1960 when he won the coveted Theatre World Award for Outstanding Performance for his performance. It was difficult for him to get on Broadway, even with his success. Actors found it challenging to make the switch to larger stages because off-Broadway productions were frequently written off as inferior. Afterwards, Maharis likened this difficulty to being trapped in the Borscht Circuit, a term that refers to small entertainment venues. His strong off-Broadway performances helped him land roles in television, where new opportunities were emerging, even though Broadway remained out of his grasp. Television was growing quickly by the late 1950s, and Maharis was able to secure a stable job in well-liked anthology shows. He made appearances in self-contained dramatic stories in Studio One, Kraft Television Theater, and Goodyear Television Playhouse. He played a gambler who mistreated his wife in the soap opera Search for Tomorrow, which is one of his more memorable roles. His on-screen persona as a tough, sulky leading man, often likened to vintage Hollywood luminaries like John Garfield and Humphrey Bogart, was shaped by these roles. He stood out in the expanding television industry thanks to this persona. In 1958, he made the switch to film with William Burke's crime drama The Mugger. Although it was a minor part, it was his first film role. 2 years later, he was cast in a more important part in Otto Preminger's epic historical drama Exodus, 1960. Paul Newman and Eva Marie Saint were among the ensemble cast members of the film, which chronicled the establishment of the State of Israel. Maharis co-starred with some of the biggest names in Hollywood as an underground freedom fighter. In addition to being a box office hit, Exodus had political significance. By publicly hiring screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, who was on the Hollywood blacklist at the time, it made a significant contribution to the end of the blacklist. George Maharis rose to fame in 1960 after landing the part of Buzz Murdoch in Route 66. He was 32 when he portrayed a 23-year-old Hell's Kitchen drifter, a tough and shrewd character who traveled the nation with Martin Milner's character, Todd Stiles. Todd was Buzz's antithesis. Raised in affluence and receiving a college education before his father's passing altered everything. Driving a Chevrolet Corvette together, they traveled from town to town, made new friends, and faced any obstacles that came their way. Route 66 was not filmed on studio sets, in contrast to the majority of shows at the time. Each episode was filmed on location in more than 25 states, as well as in portions of Canada and Mexico. The series gained new vitality from the frequent changes in the landscape. It was authentic. The well-known highway inspired the show's name. Ironically, though, a lot of the shows weren't even shot on Route 66. The road served more as a metaphor for the unknown and a route to adventure. Buzz Murdoch was made unforgettable by Maharis. He wasn't merely a one-note tough guy or a sidekick. He was a complex individual. He was marked by his past. However, he retained his loyalty and heart. He became relatable as a result, particularly to younger viewers. Another factor contributing to the success of the show was his chemistry with Milner. Although their differences caused conflict, they also shared a bond that attracted attention. Because of his outstanding performance, Maharis was nominated for an Emmy in 1962 for Outstanding Lead Actor. The show's backstage operations were as taxing as the journeys it depicted. The crew consisted of 2 Corvettes, several support vehicles, and 50 passengers. Episodes were filmed on offshore oil rigs, in remote logging camps, on shrimp boats, and even at the Glen Canyon Dam during its construction. Rising stars Alan Alda, Robert Duvall, James Caan, and Robert Redford were also on the show. It was a punishing production schedule. At the start of filming, some scripts were not finished. Work weeks grew from 6 to 7 days. Some days were as long as 16 hours. Maharis continued as long as he could, but fatigue eventually caught up with him. He developed hepatitis in 1962. He placed the blame on the demanding schedule and difficult circumstances, such as the hours he spent filming in freezing water. After he recovered, he returned, but tensions had already started to rise. Maharis requested a more relaxed schedule. The makers declined. Maharis, meanwhile, got infectious hepatitis during the second season. He was admitted to the hospital due to a serious illness, but he was already exhausted from the demanding filming schedule. The film Route 66 was not filmed on a set. Each episode was set in a different place across the nation. There were some brutal shoots. In the winter months, Maharashtra had to stand in an unheated pool for hours. Off Catalina Island, another had him waist deep in icy water. He made an effort to persevere, but his health deteriorated when he went back to work too soon. He could lose his life if he didn't slow down, according to his doctor. There was nothing he could do but leave the show. Later, Maharis described the gravity of the situation. "I am a fool if I continue at this rate. You cannot purchase another liver, even if you have $4 million in the bank." The producers didn't share his desire to safeguard his health. He was accused of fabricating his illness in order to avoid his contract. Maharis wanted to leave Route 66 to pursue a career in film, according to executive producer Herbert B. Leonard. Already, the two had been at odds over the direction of the show and Maharis' mounting discontent with the working environment. Rumors concerning Maharis' private life also began to circulate during this period. Being gay in Hollywood was risky for a career in the early 1960s. Some people thought the producers tried to hide his personal life from the media, which might have made them even more suspicious of him. The ensuing legal battle was fierce. Producers claimed that Maharis was still bound by his contract and attempted to prevent him from appearing on other programs, such as The Ed Sullivan Show. However, Maharis retaliated and ultimately prevailed in court. Since his contract was void, he was free to look for other opportunities. That was not the end of the controversy. The producers and Maharis took their fight to the media. According to Leonard and his team, he left the show at its height out of self-interest. In response, Maharis said they had made him work 14 to 16 hours a day in spite of medical advice. Supporters were divided. He was viewed by some as a mistreated and overworked actor. Some thought he had abandoned the part that brought him fame. No matter what the public thought, Route 66 never bounced back. The success of the show had been greatly attributed to Maharis. The chemistry that made the show so successful vanished when Glenn Corbett took his place in season 4. The ratings fell. The cancellation of Route 66 occurred in March 1964. Martin Milner acknowledged that directors frequently instructed Corbett to mimic Maharis' demeanor. That demonstrated how much he had been relied upon by the show. In hindsight, Maharis' departure had more to do with reasons than his health or professional goals. It exposed the harsh reality of early 1960s Hollywood. The industry was shaped by harsh work schedules, contract disputes, and unwritten rules regarding personal lives. His tale serves as a reminder that there is always a cost associated with celebrity. George Maharis set his sights on becoming a movie star after he left Route 66 in 1963. Television actors had previously made the transition to Hollywood, but Maharis found it to be far more difficult than he had anticipated. His first significant film roles were in Sylvia, 1965, The Happening, 1967, and The Satan Bug, 1965. His move to the big screen stalled nearly immediately after it started, and none of them were successful. The Satan Bug appeared to be the most promising of these movies. It had all the makings of an exciting thriller and was directed by John Sturges, the man behind The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape. Lee Barrett, portrayed by Maharis, was a former intelligence officer who was attempting to thwart a stolen bioweapon that could wipe out humanity. Modern cinematography was used in the movie, including a stabilized camera mount for helicopter shots that was revolutionary at the time. At the box office, however, none of that was helpful. Critics were uninterested, and audiences failed to relate to it. Later that year came Sylvia, a melodrama about a rich man who hires a detective to look into the past of his fiancée. Maharis took on the role of the detective. However, the movie never took off. Then, in 1967, an attempt was made to appeal to the counterculture movement with The Happening. Despite having a youthful cast, a humorous take on a crime story, and even a Supremes theme song, Maharis was unable to find success and did not produce a big hit. He had lost momentum in his film career by the end of the 1960s. In 1970, he returned to television as the star of The Most Deadly Game. Alongside Ralph Bellamy and Yvette Mimieux, Maharis played Jonathan Croft in the television series, which followed a group of criminologists as they solved intricate murders. Although the idea had promise, it was cancelled after just one season. A second door had shut. Maharis never regained the fame he had during his 66-day journey, even in the 1970s and 1980s. He appeared as a guest on well-known television programs such as Murder, She Wrote, Fantasy Island, and Mission Impossible. In an effort to sustain his career, he also took part in nightclub acts and stage productions. However, he struggled with more than just failed projects. When he was arrested in a Hollywood men's restroom in 1967, his reputation suffered greatly. He was charged with lewd conduct after being accused of making advances by a vice squad officer. The headlines almost instantly shifted against him after he entered a guilty plea later that year. Being gay in Hollywood was not only frowned upon at the time, but it was considered career suicide. Casting directors and studios shunned actors involved in such scandals. And this incident dealt Maharis a devastating blow. It occurred once more in 1974, 7 years later. This time, Maharis was taken into custody in a Los Angeles gas station restroom. Perfecto Tellez, a male hairdresser, and he were both accused of engaging in a sexual act after they were discovered together. The charge was classified as sex perversion, and Maharis was 46 at the time. The harm had already been done when he was freed on bail. This wasn't just another tabloid story for Hollywood. It was Maharis' mainstream career's last nail in the coffin. Not only was homosexuality stigmatized during this time, but it was also illegal. Losing everything could result from being outed. Up until 1973, homosexuality was still considered a mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association, and openly gay performers were frequently shunned or pushed into the background. The arrest spoke louder than any statement Maharis could have made, even though he never discussed his sexual orientation in public. His leading roles vanished, and Hollywood stopped contacting him. The scandal was a feast for tabloids. His personal life had already been the subject of rumors prior to his arrests. Some even conjectured that his departure from Route 66 might have contributed to it. He had officially left because of health problems. In Hollywood, however, rumors spread quickly. Now that his arrests were confirmed by public records, it was impossible to avoid the rumors. Maharis, however, did not vanish. He continued to find occasional work in movies and television. Despite this, the roles were scarcer. Then, in 1973, he took another risky step in between his two arrests. He was among the first famous people to appear in a nude photoshoot for Playgirl magazine. He was still regarded as a sex symbol at 45. Launched earlier that year as a female-focused response to Playboy, the magazine quickly became popular. However, its readership was not limited to women. It had a sizable gay community following as well. For its time, Maharis' full-frontal photoshoot was shocking and provocative. Some viewed it as a show of defiance, a means of repairing his reputation following his initial arrest. Others viewed it as a last-ditch effort to remain relevant by a dying star. The response was divided. Some commended his self-assurance, applauding the audacity of a middle-aged actor who embraces his sexuality and body. Others believed it to be unsuitable, indicating that he had become disconnected from the unwritten standards of decency and discretion in Hollywood. His status as an outsider was further cemented by this action, as the industry had already turned its back on him. After leaving Route 66 in the early 1960s, George Maharis' career took a different turn, but he never entirely disappeared from Hollywood. Even though he made fewer appearances, he kept acting into the 1970s and 1980s. She wrote that he took on cameos in popular TV shows like Fantasy Island, Kojak, and Murder instead of starring in them. Although they were far from the stardom he had previously enjoyed, these roles kept him in front of audiences. Additionally, he demonstrated his versatility by appearing in shows like Night Gallery, The Bionic Woman, and Mission Impossible. Even though his days as a leading man were over, he continued to be a familiar face on television, whether it was in crime dramas, thrillers, or lighthearted entertainment. Maharis looked to the stage as well as the television. In 1976, he appeared in touring productions of Guys and Dolls and Barefoot in the Park, among other theater productions. He had a solid acting background. He was more than capable of transferring from screen to stage because he had studied under Sanford Meisner and Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio and the Neighborhood Playhouse. His fame never quite matched the heights of his early years, despite these efforts. Despite his talent, Maharis found it difficult to regain the level of recognition he once enjoyed because the industry had changed. In addition to acting, he made headlines for other reasons. He was among the first male celebrities to appear in a nude photoshoot for Playgirl magazine in 1973. It was a daring move that caused controversy in addition to drawing attention to him. His acting career had slowed considerably by the late 1980s. His final significant motion picture role was in the horror thriller Doppelganger, 1993. Following that, he permanently left Hollywood. For as long as he could, Maharis continued to be involved in entertainment, even though his on-screen roles had decreased. His endeavors throughout these decades demonstrated his will to persevere in the face of adversity. His performance in Count A, a cult fantasy movie helmed by Albert Payhown, in 1982 stands out among his most memorable subsequent roles. A resurrected warlock helped a prince regain his throne in the film. Despite having a modest budget of $4 million, the production managed to make over $39 million worldwide. It was well received by fantasy moviegoers, and Maharis' performance was particularly noteworthy. Fans of genre films will remember him for his dramatic presence and intense performance in the role. Although it was a departure from the romantic roles that had characterized his previous career, it demonstrated his willingness to take on unusual and distinctive projects. In addition to The Sword and the Sorcerer, he played parts that kept him involved in the business in smaller motion pictures and television productions. However, his acting career had all but ended by the early 1990s. Following Doppelganger, he decided to leave Hollywood altogether. Even though his later works weren't popular, they showed that he was open to trying out new parts and genres. He kept taking on challenging roles as the industry changed, demonstrating that his passion for acting never diminished. Maharis focused on other artistic endeavors as his time in Hollywood came to an end. He had always had a strong interest in art, and he started painting more in the 1990s. He found satisfaction in visual art and became a skilled impressionist painter. He frequently drew inspiration for his highly expressive paintings from his personal experiences. He continued to paint in 2008, alternating between Beverly Hills and New York City. His artistic endeavors extended beyond painting. Maharis had experimented with music as well in the early 1960s. He never totally gave it up, even though acting had taken precedence over it. His deep baritone voice was featured on multiple albums he released after signing with Epic Records. George Maharis Sings, his debut album, peaked at number 10 and remained on the Billboard album chart for 29 weeks in 1962. Teach Me Tonight, his hit single, peaked at number 8 on the Easy Listening chart and number 25 on the Billboard Hot 100. Later in life, he continued to perform in nightclubs, re-establishing a connection with audiences in a more personal setting, even though his music career never became his main priority. When George Maharis' health took a terrible turn, he was at the height of his career. He was diagnosed with hepatitis during the second season of Route 66 in 1962. He was a household name thanks to the show, but his body was strained by the demanding filming schedule. Long hours, continuous travel, and physically taxing scenes were necessary for every episode. He had to film a rescue scene in freezing water one night at around 4 in the morning. His jacket had frozen by the time they were done. He was pushed over the edge that night. He experienced a relapse shortly after, which required a month-long hospital stay. It became evident that things couldn't go on as they had when he went back to work. His physician cautioned him that if he continued to exert himself, his liver might sustain irreversible harm. He might lose his life if he disregarded the warning. It couldn't have come at a worse time. He was a celebrity thanks to his role as Buzz Murdoch on the hit television series Route 66. His departure stunned fans, and rumors began to circulate. Some thought he had fabricated his illness in order to pursue a career in movies. He was criticized by others for being challenging on set, citing his health records as evidence. The rumors, however, followed him for years. Long after he left Route 66, hepatitis continued to haunt him. He talked about how the illness had made him re-evaluate everything in a 1963 interview. "You cannot buy another liver, even if you have $4 million in the bank," he said. He was aware that his health was not worth any amount of success. He never completely escaped the disease's effects, though, even though he took better care of himself. It remained a part of his reality decades later. His death at the age of 94 on May 24, 2023, was attributed in part to complications from hepatitis. The public was frequently unaware of the full scope of his difficulties during his career. When he left Route 66, studio executives were more interested in conjecture about his personal life than in the fact that he was suffering from a serious illness. He was called untrustworthy by producers, and some even questioned whether he had been ill at all. The reality was straightforward. He had been unable to keep up with the punishing pace of the show due to his health. However, in a field that required perseverance at all costs, Maharis encountered more criticism than sympathy. He attempted to rebuild his career after leaving Route 66. After transitioning into film, he made a comeback to television in 1970 with The Most Deadly Game. He never quite achieved the same level of fame, despite his decades-long acting career. In subsequent interviews, he voiced his dissatisfaction with the way the industry handled the situation and how his illness had impacted his career. He continued to work in spite of everything. Even though it seemed like Hollywood was ready to let him go, he persisted in acting into the late 20th century. Maharis had been out of the public eye for years by the time of his death. In Beverly Hills, away from the hectic world of television, he had led a more tranquil existence. However, his talent and the perseverance he displayed over the years were never forgotten by those who knew him. Compared to most actors of his era, he had experienced more. Despite his struggles with illness, industry politics, and unjust scrutiny, he made a lasting impression on American television. Following his passing, admirers and co-workers began to pay their respects. In the words of one friend, George was more than just an actor. He was a warrior who refused to be defined by the difficulties of life.